The deed trembled in my hands as I stood in the courthouse hallway, watching Dorothy Long pack her briefcase with the same precision she had used to dismantle every argument my cousin Mark Diaz had thrown at her. 3 months of legal battles, 3 months of him claiming my grandfather, Samuel Walker, had no right to leave me anything. 3 months of wondering if I would lose the only family connection I had ever known. But Dorothy had won. The farm was mine. Mark stormed past me without a word, his face red with anger and defeat. I should have felt victorious, but all I could think about was the letter Samuel had left with the deed, the one Dorothy had read aloud in court just minutes before. The warning that still echoed in my mind. Your cousin will try to take what is rightfully yours, but the land chooses its own. Trust the soil, trust the seasons, and most importantly, trust yourself. You are a walker, even if you have never known what that means. Standing there in that sterile courthouse, holding legal papers that proved I owned 200 acres of farmland in Nebraska, I felt more lost than I had ever felt in my 18 years. But I also felt something else, something I had never experienced before. I felt chosen. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story gets even more incredible, and I need you all to stick with me through every twist. Let me take you back to where this all began, 6 months earlier, when I was still just another foster kid aging out of the system with nowhere to go and no one to care. The day everything changed started like any other Tuesday at Riverside Group Home. I was folding laundry in the basement, counting down the weeks until my 18th birthday, when I would officially become too old for the system. Kimberly Cooper, one of the newer kids, was helping me sort socks when Helen Gutierrez called down the stairs. Helen had been the house manager for 12 years, and in all that time I had never heard her voice shake the way it did that morning. "Patricia Walker," she called. "Patricia Walker, you have a visitor." I remember dropping the sock I was holding and looking at Kimberly with confusion. In 4 years at Riverside, I had never had a visitor. No family, no friends from previous placements, no social workers unless it was an official visit. The other kids got visits sometimes, hopeful relatives or former foster families checking in, but never me. My file was thin, they always said. No known relatives, mother deceased, father unknown. I climbed those stairs with my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to see another social worker with paperwork about transitional housing or job placement programs. Instead, I found a man in an expensive suit sitting in Helen's office, a leather briefcase at his feet and a manila envelope in his hands. "Peter Hall," he introduced himself, extending a firm handshake. "I am an attorney from Millfield, Nebraska. I represent the estate of Samuel Walker." The name meant nothing to me. I told him there must be some mistake, that I did not know anyone named Samuel Walker. But Peter just smiled, a sad kind of smile that made me think of old photographs and unfinished conversations. "Samuel Walker was your grandfather," he said simply. "Your father's father. He passed away 3 weeks ago, and he left something for you." The envelope felt heavy in my hands, heavier than paper and ink should feel. Inside was a deed to a farm in Millfield, Nebraska, signed over to Patricia Walker, and a letter written in careful handwriting that began, "My dear granddaughter, I have spent 18 years wondering if this day would ever come." I read that letter 3 times before the words started to make sense. Samuel had been looking for me since the day I was born. My father, his son David Chavez, had died in a car accident when I was 2 years old, and my mother had disappeared shortly after, leaving me in the system. Samuel had hired private investigators, worked with social services, spent thousands of dollars trying to find me, but the system had failed him just as completely as it had failed me. By the time he finally tracked me down, he was dying of cancer. Too sick to travel, too proud to reach out through official channels that had already failed him once. He had done the only thing he could think of. He had left me everything and trusted that Peter would find me after he was gone. "The farm is yours," Peter explained, "but there are conditions. You must live on the property for at least 1 year, and you must work the land." Samuel was very specific about that. "The land chooses its own," he wrote in his will. "She needs to earn it." Helen sat beside me as Peter explained the details. 200 acres of corn and soybean fields, a farmhouse built in 1923, outbuildings that included a barn, machine shed, and grain storage. There was also a small inheritance, enough to cover the first year's expenses and basic equipment, but after that, the farm would need to support itself. I remember staring at the deed, at my name written in official, legal language, and feeling like I was reading about someone else's life. Patricia Walker, owner of Walker Farm, Millfield, Nebraska. It did not sound real. It did not sound like me. But the letter, that felt real. Samuel's words about family and belonging, about the responsibility that comes with land, about second chances and the importance of roots. He wrote about David, my father, who had loved the farm but had wanted to see the world first. He was going to come back, Samuel wrote. He always said he would come back and bring his family home. Peter gave me a week to decide. I could sell the farm, take the money, and start fresh somewhere else. Or I could go to Nebraska, try to learn farming, and see if I could make a life out of this unexpected inheritance. That night, I lay in my narrow bed at Riverside and stared at the ceiling, holding Samuel's letter against my chest. Around me, the other girls slept, but I could not quiet my mind. 18 years of wondering where I came from, of inventing stories about my family, of feeling like I was floating through life without an anchor. And suddenly, I had answers. Not all of them, but enough. I had a grandfather who had loved me before he ever met me. I had a father who had planned to come home. I had a farm, a place that belonged to me in a way nothing ever had before. The next morning, I told Helen I was going to Nebraska. She helped me pack my few belongings into 2 duffel bags, the same bags I had carried from placement to placement over the years. But this time felt different. This time I was not moving because I had to, because a placement had failed or aged out or fallen through. This time I was choosing where to go. Peter drove me to the bus station himself, pressing a thick envelope of cash into my hands for expenses and emergencies. The bus ride from Chicago to Millfield took 8 hours, 8 hours of watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to suburban neighborhoods to endless fields of green. I had never seen so much open space, so much sky. Millfield turned out to be exactly what I had expected from a small Nebraska farming town. One main street with a grain elevator at one end and a cemetery at the other, a few dozen houses scattered around a grid of tree-lined streets and farmland stretching in every direction. The bus dropped me off at the only gas station, where Peter was waiting with a pickup truck that looked older than I was. The drive to the farm took 15 minutes on gravel roads that cut straight lines between cornfields. Peter pointed out landmarks as we drove, the neighbor farms, the creek that marked the eastern boundary of my property, the old schoolhouse that had been converted into a community center. Then we crested a small hill, and I saw it for the first time. Walker Farm. The farmhouse sat in a grove of oak trees, white clapboard siding weathered to a soft gray, a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on one corner. The barn was red, the traditional bright red of every farm barn I had ever seen in pictures, with a metal roof that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Beyond the buildings, fields stretched to the horizon, row upon row of corn plants that rustled in the constant Nebraska wind. It was beautiful. It was overwhelming. It was mine. Peter had arranged for the utilities to be turned on and had stocked the refrigerator with basics. But as he handed me the keys and prepared to drive back to town, I felt the full weight of what I had undertaken. I was 18 years old, had never lived anywhere but group homes and foster houses, had never been responsible for anything more complicated than keeping my room clean and getting to school on time. Now I owned 200 acres and a house and a barn full of equipment I did not know how to use. That first night, I sat on the porch steps and watched the sunset over my fields, listening to sounds I had never heard before. No traffic, no sirens, no voices from other rooms, just wind and birds and the distant lowing of cattle from a neighboring farm. The silence should have been peaceful, but instead it felt enormous, like I might disappear into it if I was not careful. I went inside and found Samuel's bedroom, which Peter had left exactly as it was when he died. The bed was made with a faded quilt, the dresser topped with photographs and a few personal items. I picked up a framed picture of a young man in military uniform, my father David, and felt that strange disconnection again. This person was my family, but he was also a stranger. In the bottom drawer of the dresser, I found more letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Patricia Walker but never sent. Samuel had written to me for years, telling me about the farm, about the seasons, about the neighbors and the crops and the weather. Reading them felt like stepping into a conversation that had been waiting 18 years to happen. The first month was the hardest. I had inherited the farm in late June, right in the middle of growing season, and the corn and soybeans Samuel had planted in the spring needed constant attention. Ronald Nguyen, who farmed the land adjacent to mine, came by the second day to introduce himself and offer help. Ronald was in his 50s, with calloused hands and a patient way of explaining things that made me feel less stupid for not knowing the difference between a cultivator and a planter. He had been Samuel's friend for 20 years, and he took it upon himself to teach me the basics of farming with the same dedication Samuel might have shown. The land is good, he told me as we walked through the cornfield, examining the plants for signs of disease or pest damage. Samuel took care of it, and it will take care of you if you let it. But farming is not just about planting seeds and hoping for the best. You have to pay attention. You have to learn to read what the land is telling you. I learned to read a lot of things that summer. I learned to read the weather, to spot the difference between clouds that would bring gentle rain and clouds that would bring destructive storms. I learned to read the soil, to understand when it was too wet to work and when it was too dry to plant. I learned to read the plants themselves, to recognize the subtle signs of nitrogen deficiency or insect damage. But most importantly, I learned to read the community. Millfield was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where newcomers were viewed with polite suspicion until they proved themselves worthy of trust. As Samuel's granddaughter, I had a certain automatic acceptance, but I still had to earn my place. Sandra Torres, who ran the grain elevator, became my first real friend in town. She was about my age, had grown up in Millfield, but gone away to college before coming back to help run her family's business. She understood what it felt like to be young in a place where most people had known each other for decades. Sandra taught me the social geography of Millfield, who to trust and who to avoid, where to shop for groceries and where to get equipment repaired. She also taught me that being Samuel Walker's granddaughter came with expectations as well as advantages. Your grandfather was respected here, she told me one afternoon, as we sat in the office at the grain elevator, watching trucks full of wheat roll in from the harvest. He was fair in his dealings, generous with his neighbors, and he never asked for help he was not willing to give. People are going to expect the same from you. The pressure of living up to Samuel's reputation might have been overwhelming if I had not been so busy just trying to survive. Farming, I discovered, was a constant cycle of problems that needed solving. Equipment broke down, weather threatened the crops, markets fluctuated, and every day brought new challenges that required immediate attention. But I also discovered something else. I was good at solving problems. 18 years in the foster system had taught me to be resourceful, to adapt quickly to new situations, to make the best of whatever circumstances I found myself in. Those skills, it turned out, were exactly what farming required. By the end of July, I was driving the tractor with confidence, had learned to operate most of the basic equipment, and could walk through the fields and spot potential problems before they became serious. I was also starting to understand what Samuel had meant when he wrote about the land choosing its own. There was something about the rhythm of farm life, the connection between my work and the food that would eventually feed people, the satisfaction of seeing plants respond to careful attention, that felt right in a way nothing else ever had. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. August brought the first real test of my resolve. I was checking the corn one morning when I noticed something wrong with the plants in the south field. The leaves were yellowing in a pattern I did not recognize, and there was a strange smell in the air, sweet and slightly rotten. I called Ronald immediately, and he came over with David Chavez, a crop consultant who worked with several farms in the area. They walked through the field for an hour, examining plants and soil, before delivering the bad news. Fungal infection, David explained, probably came in with the wet weather we had last week. It is not catastrophic, but you are going to lose about 20% of your yield in this field if we do not treat it immediately. The treatment was expensive, more expensive than I could afford with the money Samuel had left me. But without it, I would lose a significant portion of my first harvest, which would make it almost impossible to pay the bills and prepare for the next growing season. That night, I sat at Samuel's kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of receipts, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work. I could take out a loan against the farm, but that felt like cheating somehow, like I was not really earning my place the way Samuel had intended. I was still sitting there when I heard a knock at the door. Sandra stood on the porch with a thermos of coffee and a concerned expression. "Ronald told me about the fungus," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "He also told me you are trying to figure out how to pay for treatment without borrowing money." I nodded, embarrassed by how obvious my financial struggles must be to everyone in town. Sandra poured coffee into 2 mugs and studied my calculations for a few minutes before speaking. "There is something you should know about your grandfather," she said. "He helped a lot of people over the years, quietly, without making a big deal about it. When my dad was sick and could not work his fields, Samuel harvested our crops for free. When the Henderson family lost their house in a fire, Samuel organized the whole community to rebuild it. When Ronald's son needed surgery and they could not afford it, Samuel paid the hospital bill and never mentioned it again." She pulled an envelope from her purse and set it on the table. "This is from the Farmers Cooperative Bank. Samuel had an account there that he never touched, money he saved specifically to help neighbors in emergencies. The bank president asked me to give this to you when you were ready to understand what it meant." Inside the envelope was a letter from Samuel, written in the same careful handwriting as all his others. "By the time you read this, you will have faced your first real crisis on the farm. You will be tempted to think you have to solve it alone, but that is not how farming works. Farming is a community effort, always has been. Use this money not because you need it, but because accepting help is part of earning your place." The account contained enough money to pay for the fungus treatment and several other emergencies besides. But more than the money, the letter gave me permission to be part of something larger than myself, to accept the help that comes with belonging to a community. The fungus treatment worked, and by September, my corn was ready for harvest. I had been dreading this moment for weeks, knowing that operating the combine harvester was far more complicated than anything else I had learned so far. The machine was enormous, worth more than most people's houses, and one mistake could destroy both the equipment and the crop. Ronald offered to harvest my fields for me, the same way Samuel had helped other neighbors. But I knew I needed to do this myself. If I was going to be a real farmer, I had to learn to handle every aspect of the operation. Mark Diaz, my cousin, chose that moment to make his first appearance in my life. I was in the machine shed, going over the combine manual for the 100th time, when an expensive sedan pulled into the farmyard. The man who got out looked like an older version of the photographs I had seen of my father, same dark hair and strong jaw, but where David had looked kind and open in the pictures, Mark looked calculating and cold. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I have been meaning to come by and meet you," he said, looking around the farmyard with obvious appraisal. "Quite a place Samuel left you." Mark explained that he was David's cousin, which made him my cousin too, though he was 15 years older than me. He had grown up in Omaha, worked in real estate development, and had never shown any interest in the farm while Samuel was alive. But now, he said, he was concerned about my ability to handle such a large operation. "Farming is not something you can just pick up, Tricia. It takes years of experience, generations of knowledge." Samuel was probably not thinking clearly at the end, leaving all this to someone so young and inexperienced. He offered to buy the farm from me for what he called a fair price, though the number he mentioned was significantly less than what Peter had told me the property was worth. When I declined, politely but firmly, his friendly demeanor slipped just enough for me to see the anger underneath. "You are going to fail," he said, getting back into his car. "And when you do, I will still be here to help clean up the mess." That conversation lit a fire under me that I had not known I possessed. I spent the next week studying everything I could find about combine operation, practicing on the simulator program Ronald had shown me, and going over every detail of the harvest plan until I could recite it in my sleep. When harvest day finally came, half the town showed up to watch. Some came out of genuine support, others out of curiosity to see if the city girl could actually pull it off. Sandra brought coffee and sandwiches for the volunteers who had offered to help with grain transport, and even Peter drove out from town to observe. The first few rows were terrifying. The combine was loud and complicated, with dozens of gauges and controls that all seemed critically important. But gradually, as I found the rhythm of the machine and learned to read the flow of grain into the tank, my confidence grew. By the end of the day, I had successfully harvested 40 acres of corn without any major problems. The yield was good, better than Ronald had expected, and the grain quality was excellent. As I climbed down from the combine cab, covered in dust and chaff but grinning with pride, Sandra started clapping. Soon everyone joined in, a spontaneous celebration of my first successful harvest. That night, I called Peter to tell him about the day. He listened to my excited account of grain moisture levels in bushels per acre, then delivered news that brought me back to earth with a thud. Mark has filed a legal challenge to Samuel's will, he said. He is claiming that Samuel was not competent when he signed the documents and that the farm should have gone to him as the nearest blood relative. The legal battle consumed the next 3 months. Mark hired an expensive law firm from Omaha and began building a case that painted Samuel as a senile old man who had been manipulated into leaving his property to a stranger. He produced medical records showing that Samuel had been taking pain medication for his cancer, argued that the medications had affected his judgment, and claimed that I had somehow influenced him to change his will. The fact that Samuel and I had never met while he was alive should have made that argument ridiculous. But Mark's lawyers were skilled at creating doubt. They suggested that I might have contacted Samuel through intermediaries, that the private investigators he had hired might have been working for me instead of him, that the whole situation was an elaborate fraud designed to steal a valuable farm from its rightful heir. Dorothy Long, the lawyer Peter recommended to represent me, was everything Mark's legal team was not. Where they were flashy and aggressive, she was quiet and methodical. Where they relied on dramatic accusations, she focused on facts and documentation. The case will ultimately come down to one question, she explained during our first meeting. Did Samuel Walker have the mental capacity to make decisions about his property when he wrote his will? Everything else is just noise. Dorothy spent weeks gathering evidence to support Samuel's competency. She interviewed his doctors, his neighbors, his banker, anyone who had interacted with him during his final months. She collected records showing that he had continued to make sound business decisions right up until his death, that he had been actively managing the farm, that he had been lucid and engaged with his community. Most importantly, she found the letters. Not just the ones Samuel had written to me, but correspondence with lawyers, private investigators, and social service agencies spanning nearly 2 decades. The letters showed a clear, consistent pattern of a man desperately searching for his lost granddaughter and planning for the day when he might find her. But Mark's team had resources I could not match. They hired expert witnesses to testify about the effects of pain medication on cognitive function. They brought in psychologists to discuss the vulnerability of elderly patients facing terminal illness. They even found a handwriting expert who claimed that Samuel's signature on the will showed signs of physical impairment. The worst part was how the legal battle divided the community. Most of Samuel's friends and neighbors supported me, but Mark was persuasive when he wanted to be. He talked about family loyalty, about keeping the farm in the hands of people who understood its history, about the dangers of letting outsiders take over agricultural land. Some people began to question whether I really belonged in Millfield, whether Samuel had made a mistake in leaving me the farm. I could see the doubt in their faces when I went to town for supplies, could hear the whispered conversations that stopped when I walked into the grain elevator or the hardware store. The uncertainty was almost worse than the legal proceedings themselves. I continued to work the farm, preparing for spring planting, while the lawyers argued over whether I would be allowed to keep it. I attended community meetings and church services, trying to maintain normal relationships while everyone waited to see how the case would be resolved. Sandra remained steadfastly in my corner, as did Ronald and most of the other farmers who had worked closely with me during the harvest. But I could feel the community holding its breath, waiting to see which way the wind would blow before committing to either side. The trial was scheduled for March, just as spring planting season was beginning. Dorothy warned me that the outcome was far from certain, that Mark's arguments about family rights and Samuel's mental state might resonate with a jury, especially if they were not familiar with the full context of the situation. The night before the trial began, I sat in Samuel's kitchen reading through his letters one more time. In one of them, written just a few months before he died, He had included a passage that seemed especially relevant. "The land does not care about our human arguments over ownership," he wrote. "The land cares about who will tend it with respect, who will protect it for future generations, who will understand that we are only temporary stewards of something much larger than ourselves. I am leaving you the farm not because you are my blood, but because I believe you will love it the way it deserves to be loved." That letter gave me the courage to testify on my own behalf, something Dorothy had been reluctant to recommend. She worried that Mark's lawyers would try to paint me as an opportunistic outsider who had manipulated my way into an inheritance I did not deserve. But I knew that if I did not speak for myself, if I did not tell my own story in my own words, the jury would never understand what the farm really meant to me. They would see only the legal arguments in the competing claims, not the deeper truth about belonging and family and the choices we make about where to build our lives. When I took the witness stand, I told them about growing up in foster care, about the loneliness of never knowing where I came from, about the moment when Peter Hall walked into the group home and handed me a letter from a grandfather I had never known existed. I told them about learning to farm, about the community that had welcomed me, about the responsibility I felt to honor Samuel's legacy. Most importantly, I told them about the land itself, about walking through the fields in the early morning and feeling connected to something larger than myself, about understanding, for the first time in my life, what it meant to have roots. Mark's lawyers tried to undermine my testimony by focusing on my lack of agricultural experience, my youth, my status as an outsider to the community. They suggested that my emotional attachment to the farm was superficial, that I was motivated more by the financial value of the inheritance than by any genuine connection to farming. But Dorothy had prepared me well for their attacks. When they questioned my commitment to agriculture, I described the fungus outbreak and how I had chosen to invest in treatment rather than take the easy path of selling the crop for whatever I could get. When they suggested that I was only interested in the farm's monetary value, I explained why I had turned down Mark's offer to buy the property, even though the legal battle had put my ownership in jeopardy. The turning point came when Dorothy introduced Samuel's medical records, not the selective excerpts Mark's team had used, but the complete files showing his interactions with doctors and nurses throughout his illness. The records painted a picture of a man who remained sharp and engaged even as his body failed, who continued to ask detailed questions about his treatment and make informed decisions about his care. Dr. Helen Gutierrez, Samuel's oncologist, testified that he had been mentally competent right up until the day he died. She described conversations they had had about the farm, about his hopes for finding his granddaughter, about his detailed plans for ensuring the property would be properly maintained after his death. The most powerful moment came when Dorothy read aloud from Samuel's correspondence with the private investigators he had hired to find me. The letters showed not just his determination to locate his lost granddaughter, but his careful consideration of what would happen if and when he found her. In one letter, written more than a year before his death, Samuel had outlined his reasoning for leaving me the farm. He acknowledged that I might not be interested in farming, that I might choose to sell the property and use the money for other purposes. But he also expressed his hope that I would give the land a chance, that I would discover the same connection to farming that had sustained his family for 3 generations. "If she chooses to stay," he wrote, "she will earn the right to call this place home. If she chooses to leave, at least she will have had the opportunity to know where she came from." That letter, more than any legal argument, seemed to convince the jury that Samuel had made his decision with full knowledge of the risks and consequences. When the verdict came back in my favor, I felt not just relief but vindication. The farm was mine, not because of legal technicalities or family connections, but because Samuel had chosen to trust me with his legacy. Mark left town the same day the verdict was announced, but not before making one final attempt to convince me to sell him the farm. He found me in the machine shed where I was preparing equipment for spring planting and made an offer that was significantly higher than his original proposal. "You won," he said, "but winning a legal case and succeeding as a farmer are 2 different things. You are still young, still inexperienced. One bad year, one major equipment failure, one drop in commodity prices, and you could lose everything." I listened to his arguments, the same ones I had been hearing for months about my youth and inexperience, and the challenges facing small farmers in an increasingly complex agricultural economy. But I also thought about everything I had learned during my first year on the farm, about the community that had supported me through the legal battle, about the satisfaction I felt when I walked through fields I had planted and tended myself. "Thank you for the offer," I told him, "but the farm is not for sale, not to you, not to anyone." Mark shook his head as he walked away, but I thought I saw something like respect in his expression. He had underestimated me from the beginning, assuming that a foster kid with no agricultural background could never succeed in farming. The legal victory had proven him wrong about my right to inherit the farm, but only time would prove him wrong about my ability to keep it. Spring planting that year felt different from everything I had done before. Instead of learning someone else's system, I was implementing my own plans, making my own decisions about what crops to plant where, what inputs to use, how to manage the soil and water, and nutrients that would determine the success of the harvest. Ronald continued to serve as my mentor and advisor, but he also began treating me as a peer rather than a student. We discussed market conditions and weather patterns as equals, sharing information and insights based on our respective experiences and perspectives. The community's attitude toward me had shifted as well. The legal victory had settled the question of my right to be there. But more importantly, my behavior during the trial had demonstrated my commitment to staying and succeeding. People who had been reserving judgment now offered their full support and friendship. Sandra and I started a tradition of Friday evening dinners, taking turns cooking for each other and talking about everything from farming techniques to small-town politics to our plans for the future. Those conversations helped me understand not just how to be a farmer, but how to be a member of a community, how to balance independence with interdependence. By summer, I felt confident enough in my farming skills to start thinking about improvements and innovations. I researched cover crops that could improve soil health, investigated precision agriculture technologies that could increase efficiency, and began planning for the day when I might expand the operation or diversify into new crops. But the most important change was internal. I had stopped thinking of myself as an outsider who was trying to fit in and started thinking of myself as someone who belonged. The farm was not just my inheritance anymore, it was my home. Millfield was not just the place where I happened to live, it was my community. The second harvest was everything the first one had promised to be. My corn yields were up 20% from the previous year, the result of better soil management and more precise timing of inputs. The soybean crop was equally successful, with excellent protein content that earned premium prices at the grain elevator. More importantly, I had learned to read the subtle signs that distinguish good farming from great farming. I could tell by the color of the corn leaves whether the plants were getting adequate nutrition, could predict by the feel of the soil whether it was ready for field operations, could judge by the behavior of the plants themselves whether they were stressed by weather or disease or pests. The financial success of the second year allowed me to start thinking about long-term improvements. I invested in new drainage tile for the low-lying fields, upgraded the grain storage facilities, and purchased a newer tractor that was more fuel efficient and easier to maintain. But the real measure of my success was not financial. It was the recognition I received from other farmers in the community. When the local farm bureau asked me to serve on their board of directors, I knew I had truly earned my place among my peers. The invitation came from David Chavez, the crop consultant who had helped me deal with the fungus outbreak during my first year. He had watched my progress with interest, he said, and believed that my perspective as a young farmer and newcomer to the community would be valuable to the organization. Serving on the Farm Bureau board gave me a chance to contribute to discussions about agricultural policy, environmental regulations, and economic development that affected all farmers in the region. It also gave me a platform to advocate for programs that supported beginning farmers, something I felt passionate about based on my own experience. I started mentoring other young farmers who were just starting out, sharing the knowledge I had gained and the resources that had been shared with me. There was something deeply satisfying about passing on the lessons I had learned, about being part of the chain of knowledge and support that had sustained agriculture in the community for generations. One of my mentees was a young man named Ronald Nguyen Jr., the son of my neighbor and advisor. He had grown up on the farm, but had gone away to college to study agricultural engineering, and he was now returning to help modernize his family's operation. Working with Ronald Jr. reminded me of my own journey from complete ignorance to competent farmer, but it also showed me how much I had learned, how far I had come from the frightened 18-year-old who had stepped off the bus in Millfield 3 years earlier. The farm was thriving, but more than that, I was thriving. I had found not just a place to live, but a purpose that gave meaning to my daily work. I had discovered not just a community, but a family of choice that supported and challenged me in equal measure. On quiet evenings, I still sat on the porch and read Samuel's letters, but now they felt like conversations with a grandfather I had finally gotten to know. His words about the land choosing its own had proven prophetic, but not in the way I had originally understood them. The land had not chosen me because of some mystical connection or inherited ability. The land had chosen me because I had chosen it, because I had been willing to learn what it needed and provide what it required, because I had understood that farming was not just about growing crops, but about growing communities and relationships in a way of life that connected past and future. 5 years after that first bus ride to Millfield, I stood in the same courthouse where Dorothy Long had defended my right to inherit Samuel's farm. But this time I was there for a different reason. I was getting married to Peter Hall, the lawyer who had first brought me news of my inheritance and who had become much more than a legal advisor over the years. Our relationship had developed slowly, built on shared conversations about the farm, the community, and our respective dreams for the future. Peter had grown up in Millfield, but had left for law school and a career in the city, returning only when his father became ill and needed help with the family practice. Like me, he had discovered that small-town life offered something he had not known he was missing. Like me, he had found that belonging to a community was more satisfying than the independence he had thought he wanted. The wedding was held in the community center, the old schoolhouse that had been converted into a gathering space for town events. Sandra was my maid of honor, and Ronald Nguyen walked me down the aisle in place of the father I had never known. Half the town attended, the same people who had watched me learn to farm, who had supported me through the legal battle, who had welcomed me into their community and made me one of their own. Mark Diaz sent a wedding gift, a crystal vase with a note that said simply, "Congratulations on proving me wrong. I hope you will be very happy." It was the first communication I had received from him since the trial, and it felt like a final acknowledgement that I had earned my place in the family and the community. After the ceremony, we drove out to the farm for the reception, held in the barn that I had been afraid to enter during my first week in Millfield. The same barn now hosted community events regularly, from harvest celebrations to holiday parties to fundraisers for local causes. As I looked around at the faces of friends and neighbors, at the farmland stretching beyond the open barn doors, at the man I had married and the life we were planning together, I felt the deep satisfaction of knowing exactly where I belonged. The foster care system had failed to give me a family, but it had given me something else, the resilience and adaptability that had allowed me to build a family of my own choosing. Samuel's inheritance had given me land and money, but more importantly, it had given me the opportunity to discover who I was capable of becoming. That night, as Peter and I sat on the porch of our farmhouse, watching the sunset over fields we would tend together, I thought about all the young people still growing up in foster care, still wondering where they came from and where they belonged. I thought about Samuel's words, about the land choosing its own, and I realized that belonging is not something that happens to you. It is something you create through the choices you make and the commitments you keep. If you are watching this and you have ever felt lost or disconnected or like you do not fit anywhere, I want you to know that your story is not over. Home is not just the place where you were born or the people who share your blood. Home is the place where you choose to plant roots, where you choose to invest your time and energy and love. The farm taught me that growth requires both good soil and careful tending, that the strongest plants are often the ones that have weathered the most storms, that patience and persistence can turn the most unlikely circumstances into something beautiful and productive. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what home means to you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they belong somewhere, that their story matters, that there is a place in this world where they can not just survive, but thrive. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about finding family in unexpected places. about the courage it takes to build a life from scratch, about the communities that form around shared work and common purpose. Remember, you do not have to know where you came from to know where you are going. You do not have to inherit a place to earn the right to call it home. Sometimes the best families are the ones we choose for ourselves, and sometimes the strongest roots are the ones we plant with our own hands.